welcome again to the latest edition of the KGOU Readers Club. I'm KGOU Managing Editor Logan Layden. Thanks for joining me for the next hour as we highlight the book The Bone Picker from OU Press and award-winning author Devin Mahisua. Kirkus Reviews calls it a chilling collection of stories about the tricksters and other beings of Choctaw lore who refuse to be forgotten. It's an appropriate selection as we head into October, but there's so much more to The Bone Picker than scary stories to tell around the campfire. I have the author, Devin Mahisua. She's with me to discuss the book. Devin, thanks for making the time to be with me today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Logan. I appreciate it.
Not at all. And just to be clear, The Bone Picker, which we're going to be discussing here, it's released in early October, right?
I think October the 8th. Yes.
October the 8th. Well, again, welcome. I want to, before we get into a discussion of the book, if I could have you just sort of give us an overview of what the listeners will be reading if they pick up The Bone Picker. Basically, describe the book to us. What are we getting into here?
Well, The Bone Picker is a collection of dark fiction and horror short stories in historical Indian territory and present-day Oklahoma that, of course, became a state in 1907. And it focuses on cosmological entities and the social, political, and religious issues of the Choctaw Nation, as well as a couple that deal with Ned Christie, who was a Cherokee.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I say, there's a lot more to this, and we'll get into it than just some scary stories here. I really learned a lot about Choctaw history and some of the beliefs going back centuries and centuries. But at the beginning here, let's talk about you a little bit. A lot of times with our Readers Club program, I'll get emails from listeners wanting to know more about the author, other works that you've done. You're an award-winning author. If you could tell us a little bit about yourself and your previous work before we get into The Bone Picker here.
Sure. Yeah, I'm the Corley Beers Prize Professor in the Hall Center for the Humanities at the University of Kansas. And I'm a former editor of the American Indian Quarterly and the University of Nebraska Press's book series, Contemporary Indigenous Issues. And I'm an enrolled citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. And I'm a historian by training. And I've written probably over 100 books and articles about topics that I really am concerned about, including racism, stereotypes, genocide, treaty abrogation, indigenous food sovereignty, ethnic fraud, missing and murdered indigenous women and boys, desecration of native burials, boarding schools, and fake news. And I also write novels, and recently just signed a multi-book deal with Bantam Random House for a new detective series. And the first is called Blood Relay, and that will be out next year.
What was it that drew you to this type of work? Obviously, growing up, you can make any number of decisions about what you want to do with your life. What drew you to this? How did you get where you are?
Well, I am a historian, like I said, and the way that I write is I take a look at the situation where we are today, and I look back to see how is it that we got to where we are, and what hopefully are some solutions that we can come up with to solve these issues. All that long list of things that I just told you that I like to write about. And I write what I know, and I pull from the places, the culture, the people, the plants, animals, weather, terrain, and the situations that I have been in and things that have affected me. So everything that I write has great personal meaning to me and to my tribe and to other tribes. So what you will see in these stories is or other places where my family's from, where they're buried, situations I've encountered, and also me trying to answer some of my own questions.
Yeah, and this is the first book of yours that I have actually read. But we do see, and as I mentioned here in just a little bit, in the afterword for the book, there are aspects of some of your previous work that sort of make their way into The Bone Picker, right? Ned Christie you mentioned as sort of one of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ned Christie, was a real person, and that book I think came out in 2018, and that book dissects how the press created his image as an outlaw, because he was accused of murdering a U.S. Deputy sheriff in 1887. And he was killed by a posse 5 years later after they blew up his house with dynamite, and they killed him when he ran outside. And so I wanted to correct the wrongs that had been done to him. I felt very strongly about that. And I did get permission from his family to write about him. But Cherokees also have stories about Ned, that he could shapeshift. And so in the story that I wrote about Ned that appears in this anthology, it's called Ned Christie, and it has him shapeshifting in there. So I don't know that I would call that horror. I think that might be part of the subheading of the book, which is alternate histories, because people believe that to be real. And then another story is called Insane Indian, which is based on his young cousin Archwolf, who had been convicted after Ned was killed, to 5 years for whiskey selling, and also it was a dubious, questionable charge of assault with intent to kill. And what happened to him, he was only supposed to be in jail for 5 years, but he ultimately was sent to Canton Asylum for Insane Indians, where he spent over half of his life, and he eventually died there, and he never did come back home to Indian Territory. And so to me, one might call that horror. I think that's more dark nonfiction because it was his reality. And insane asylums can be terrible enough. And I thought that that really could find a place in this book. In many respects, I think writing about Arch was even tougher than writing about Ned, what happened to him.
Yeah, and I do want to ask about that. We got to kind of walk the line a little bit. I don't want to give away all the stories in the book, but that one in particular, yeah, with Arch being in that insane asylum, basically coming across Ned once again. There
Yes.
toward the end. Like I said, I've got a lot of questions about the Bone Picker after reading it, but we don't want to give too much away. There are interesting connections among the characters and the entities across many of the stories in the book. Some of those questions are answered and addressed in the afterword. That sort of brings things together a little bit. But I do want to let the listeners or the readers get to that themselves. Let's talk about Choctaw lore and how the
Mhm.
spirit world and the physical world are one in the same. I learned a lot from this book. I'm from Southeast Oklahoma, McAllister, grew up there my whole life until I, came up here to Oklahoma City, and I didn't know these things. For those of us who aren't already familiar, if you could explain sort of how that works and the roles that these beings have played in Choctaw history over time.
Okay. First I want to say, Logan, my father was born and raised in McAllister, and his father was the chief of police of McAllister. And so that's where my grandparents are buried. So yes, I probably know the area where you lived.
Yes, indeed.
Well, all cultures all cultures have creation stories, and many would argue that the works of the Creator are all around us. And many will say that by not respecting these gifts, the plants, the animals, the water, the air, the soil, and each other, that we will perish. And we may not see the spirits, but we might often see them out of the corner of our eye. We might hear an owl hoot and think really it's a harbinger of something bad. I live by the University of Kansas and Baker University nature centers, and I go out every morning. I go out 50 miles a week, and I hear these owls hooting, and with among Choctaws, as well as a lot of other tribes, the hooting of an owl means you might be hearing some bad news because something bad has happened or it's about to happen. So you wonder, is this real? Or am I just hearing an owl hoot? I don't know. I get very nervous, but I hear them every day, and I always rush home. Is everything okay? And it is, but still, I get worried. But the tribal storytelling about the spirit world is meant to impart information and to teach lessons. And so the image of the elders sitting around the campfire telling stories to the youngsters is a way to look at it. They're teaching, they're telling history of the culture, they're telling you how to behave. And what I find interesting about these dark fiction and horror stories is how people react and how they behave when they're put up against weird or scary situations or entities. Monsters can be very interesting, like Alien, Predator. That deer thing in the movie The Right, if you saw that, it's this big deer thing that has arms coming out of its face. I mean, I focused way too much on that pause screen trying to figure out what in the world is that. But I'm more invested in how humans choose to confront them. So in dark fiction, which I think is more psychological and deals with people, horror deals with monsters. So for example, in that first story, we've got Ellis. How is it that he decides to react to these entities that he encounters? He's got very different reactions to some of these Choctaw entities. And that's what I find kind of fascinating. But I think back to your question, the spiritual world and the physical world, you don't necessarily have to see the spirits, but you might know that they are there, or you believe that they are there, and that's what's important.
And they're here in Oklahoma, according to
Oh yeah.
the lore. Followed the Choctaws during removal here, and there was one part in the book where it was discussed. Well, the folks who think the Earth is hollow, that's tinfoil hat stuff. That's not what we're talking about here. But there's a way they're able to get around being below the surface, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And in fact, I really explore that in a previous horror novel that I wrote, Hatak Witches. That came out with Arizona Press, and a lot of these entities, and actually a lot of tribes do believe that they emerged from underground into the upper world. And um, but I do want to say that there are the Mississippi band of Choctaws, and so you would have to ask them what they think about these entities, because some of them would have stayed behind, right? I don't know. It's just I can't speak for them. You'd have to ask. But yeah, the ones that came across, they followed. Came across with the Trail of Tears. You didn't really see them. They were there.
Because they were moving through underground tunnels. There's a whole underworld, right, where
Hmm.
a lot of these creatures will be will move around without being seen uh, above ground, but they
It's
can
kind of
be
it would be
seen.
hard,
Yeah.
right? Now it would be hard to miss a Shompi, which is the Choctaw version of say Bigfoot. And many tribes do have we'll call it a Bigfoot, but every tribe has a different name for this entity, I guess, creature. And they're large, hairy, smelly beings. And with Choctaws, they we don't really hear a lot of stories about them being evil, and so I don't believe that they are. I choose to believe that they are not. I see them as kind of benevolent. They're just kind of stinky and maybe scare you. And if you look around Oklahoma, you probably have seen this. A lot of people have those big metal cutouts of Bigfoot. I've
Mhm.
got one. I've got a 10-foot tall one in the front. And then I've got a much smaller one by the front door. He's got Mardi Gras beads around his neck. But you see those all over the place now. Bigfoot is kind of a big thing.
Oh
People love
yeah,
them.
absolutely. I've actually, well, it's been several years now, but did a story down in far southeast Oklahoma, down in the Broken Bow area, where
Mhm.
Bigfoot is a very big deal. And honestly, I was talking to a guy who had an encounter. Um, I don't generally subscribe to that stuff, but I have full certainty believed that he believes that he encountered Bigfoot. In fact, when I went down there, he took me out to the campsite where he had seen Bigfoot or claimed to have seen him, and hadn't been out there in years, and sure enough, there was a weathered tent. The colors of the tent had been sort of sun drenched over the years. The first time he had been back there, and he was dead serious that he saw something out in those woods. Well, the book is The Bone Picker, and the author is Devin Mahisua. I'm Logan Layden, and this is the KGOU Readers Club. Back with more after a short break. We're back with the KGOU Readers Club. I'm KGOU Managing Editor Logan Layden, and I'm joined by Devin Mahisua, author of the new book, The Bone Picker, as we continue our discussion. As we make the transition here, because I do want to talk about some of these entities individually, and we can start. Shampy? Am I saying it right?
Shampy.
Shampy.
Yeah. And there
Okay.
are the Oklahoma monkey chasers, by the way. There are people who go out there and look, and people are absolutely serious about it.
Mm-hmm. And there are
I do believe it.
Bigfoot comparisons
Oh, yeah.
with them. Again, sort of describe this particular creature, if it's okay to call them creature, entity, spirit. There's a story in the book where some bad guys tried to frame one of them for a murder they didn't do. They seem to, as you say, not be necessarily these evil characters out to do harm. What are they in Choctaw lore?
So are you talking about Justice, the short story Justice?
Yes.
Where, yes. So this is based from a nonfiction book that I wrote that was partially about my great-great-grandfather, who was a sheriff of Sugarloaf County in Moshletobe District. And he was killed by rival political gang, I guess. He was a nationalist, they were progressives, and so they murdered him in 1884. They eventually were exonerated by a jury of people who were actually their business partners. And the judge was also very good friends with these men. One person, his name was Jackson Crow, he tried to say that he was actually a freedman, but he was not on the freedman rolls, so therefore he could not be tried in Choctaw court. He had to go to Fort Smith, and he was found guilty, and he was hanged in 1889. So this story, Justice, that has always made me angry, because the guys who got off, they became wealthy, political, kind of powerful political figures in Choctaw history, and nothing was ever done to them. So this was kind of my opportunity to get some justice. Um, we had one of the Choctaw entities kind of step in there and mess things up and stir the pot for them. So that's one thing, that's one reason why I like writing these stories, is that I can change endings. I can make these the way I want them to be. So it gave me a lot of satisfaction, this one.
Yeah, sure. And you mentioned the Crows, the family.
Yes.
Whenever we're talking about these different entities, some of them, many of them aren't necessarily out to do harm. The review called them, tricksters, like to, annoy people, scare them, but not actually out to hurt them. Crows are a little different, seem more on the evil side of things.
Yes, I introduced this Crow family. It, that's their last name. It's called Crow, not the Crow tribe. They are evil shapeshifters who can take the form of great horned owls. And so I introduced them in my first novel, Roads of My Relations. That was in 2000. Gosh, this is almost 24, 25 years ago. And they also made a reappearance in Hatak Witches. And so I brought them back here for these short stories. But yes, they really are malevolent, and they do mean to do harm, and they don't feel badly about it either.
And just
And if you
well, out of my curiosity, the first story in the book, the cornfield, I think, Ellis is one
Mhm.
of them. Is that right?
He is
Yeah.
one of
Okay.
them, but
Yeah.
he's not, he's even more of the black sheep of the family. I mean, he's even gone off on his own and he's doing his own thing. And so, as we see in that short story, he's hundreds of years old. So, we first see him way back right after removal. And then I bring it up to today in relatively short pages, right? And then he kind of has to face up to what has he been doing all this time.
Huh. Yeah, and we see that. We see that going back hundreds of years, and over the course of that one short story, we end up in modern times, and he's still doing his thing, tormenting people and coaxing
Yes.
them down into the underworld. Um,
Mhm.
Bone pickers. See, now this is one of the interesting things about the book. You know, we're talking about these various entities, figures of lore and legend. The book's namesake is the Bone Picker, and those were actual people. First, before we talk about why did you choose that for the title of the book, of all the
Actually,
different directions that you could have gone in for it?
the title of the book actually was The Deer Man,
Uh-huh.
but the press really wanted The Bone Picker. So that's where I went. And I'm not saying that's a bad choice. It's just the original title really was The Deer Man. Um, but I think The Bone Picker, maybe they thought it's very eye-catching, like the bone picker. What do you mean by that? And then you want to investigate it. So that's why we went there with that title.
Well, those were not creatures of lore. There were such things as bone pickers. If you could explain what they would do and their importance.
Yes, the bone pickers were actual entities in the Choctaw among the Choctaws. So after a person passed away, that person would be put on a scaffold for months until they, well, start to deteriorate, decompose. And then when they get to a certain point, you call in the bone picker who has long fingernails and who would literally just get on top of that scaffold and then just pull off the remaining flesh and drop it into a little fire down below until there's no flesh left on the bones. Then those bones are put into a bone house, like put into a little box, and then you put the box in a bone house. And then when the bone house is full, you cover up the whole thing. So it's a mound. So you end up with just a mound of bones, essentially. Around the same time that the tribe was utilizing these bone pickers, they also were engaging in, or many of them were in head flattening, because the Choctaws did do, they put the baby in the cradle board and they wrapped their head very tightly, and so you'd end up with a very high forehead. They were outlawed around the same time, or they just fell out of I don't want to say popularity because there were some people who still wanted to use bone pickers and who still wanted to do head flattening. But the tribe as a whole had really embraced what the missionaries had to say, and they just did not want either one of those things to be happening anymore. So the bone pickers kind of faded away. In my imagination, you still had traditionalists who did employ the bone pickers. Where they lived, I don't know, but one would certainly think that they would still exist for a while. And in
Well,
my mind, they did, at
well,
least.
yeah, and as you got sort of later into history, as the influence of Christianity became more prominent for a Choctaw who had been raised Christian while that practice was still going on, to come across it in the woods, as we see in the book, would it be a pretty horrifying experience? I would think.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Hmm.
Hmm. So let's talk about the witch killer again. There's a real historical event sort of intertwined into this story. At least that's what I took away from it. There was, in fact, someone who was persecuting what he thought were witches, actually.
Yes, the Choctaw witch killer, it's about Solomon Hotema, who was a real person. He was a full-blood Choctaw attorney. He was a Presbyterian minister and a Kiamichi County judge. And in 1899, Solomon murdered three people whom he believed to be witches responsible for instigating a meningitis outbreak in his neighborhood. And that also killed his young son. And Solomon is fascinating to me because he could speak Choctaw Nampa, the Choctaw language, but he also could quote the Bible backwards and forwards. You know, I read his papers and he's got this beautiful handwriting and he could write in both English and Choctaw Nampa. He knew all of the biblical passages that referred to witches, sorcerers, demons, tellers of fortunes, magicians, spiritists, unclean spirits, serpents, etc. And but what he did, he took the advice of a traditional Choctaw medicine man who said, I do believe that witches instigated this meningitis outbreak. But that man wasn't talking about the biblical witches. There's two different things. And so here's Solomon trying to mesh these together. And I could just sense an awful lot of confusion with this man. And I think many religious stories are told to keep people in line and to control them. And passages in the Bible can be interpreted in various ways, depending on what you want the passages to mean. And in many cases, the preacher, the priest, the pastor, whoever, they give the sermon, and you, as part of the congregation, are supposed to nod your head, right, and go along with it. But I think that with tribal stories, everyone is told that certain entities exist, and you, as a thinking human, are supposed to use your critical thinking skills that you're blessed with to take heed and behave according to how you have interpreted the stories. So, to me, Solomon Hotema's story, The Witch Killer, is more dark fiction than horror, because here you have this man who's languishing in jail and now he's thinking back to, well, did I do the right thing? And were these truly witches out of the Bible? Because he does believe that he saw a witch ball come flying through his house one time. He saw it come through the house and it landed on his fireplace, I think. And, or is it, these are other kinds of witches that he doesn't know anything about? Or is it just no witches at all and it was just a disease? And so to me, it's a really interesting kind of confused story because he is Choctaw and he knows and understands those stories, but yet he feels pressure. He's got to be a Presbyterian minister like his father was. So there's no real clear-cut answers to it. I kind of put that out there for the reader, I think.
Yeah. Well, he sort of, yeah, he mixes it all together
Mm-hmm.
and then acts on what he thinks is the right thing to do, which cost what seemed to me to probably innocent people. They weren't actually witches, the people that he killed.
No,
Right.
one of the
Yeah.
people he killed was his
Yeah.
sister-in-law.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
You know, and she's like, wait, what are you doing? And she's holding her child in her arms and he blasts her in the back, you know, and at the time he thought I'm doing the right thing.
Hmm.
And then comes the second guessing.
Right.
So
So much later, yeah, whenever he's in jail for it, but trying to sort of lay his case out so maybe people would understand uh,
yes.
what he had done. One of the ones that uh, sort of stuck with me was grass water drop. The imagery of just a floating blue heart a few feet off the ground, and that's all you can see of this creature was particularly, I guess, creepy to me. But again, we're not necessarily talking about an evil figure here. In fact, the appearance of that entity in the book is to help someone, right? Can you talk about grass water drop? And I'll
Yeah,
let you
grass.
pronounce the
Yeah. Well, I'm
proper
not sure
name.
that I can.
Yeah.
I've asked some of my Choctaw speaking friends, and they're not quite sure either. But yes, you're right. It's a floating blue heart
Yeah.
um, that supposedly hunters and campers, when you get out in the woods, it's very much like the deer man in that if they feel like it, they're going to have you follow them and follow them and follow them until you get hopelessly lost, or you just get lost to the point where you sit down and cry. And that was all they wanted to do, was to get you lost.
Yeah.
And in this particular story, I really like Peaches Clay because she kind of reminds me of when I was in junior high school. Because if you took note of the books that she was reading, when I was in junior high school, you could buy books for a quarter. And I remember how exciting it was that those books would come in every 2 weeks together with a rubber band around them, little paperbacks like Journey to the Center of the Earth and Dracula and Frankenstein and Turn of the Screw. And so there she is sitting up there on that railroad, abandoned railroad trestle, I guess, looking down at the water, reading her books. And then she's harassed by these boys. And one day they take it too far. And luckily there's grass water drop. And they do get punished, don't they?
They do indeed meet an unfortunate end. But again, we'll let the readers discover that for themselves. Little People. That I do want to spend a little bit of time on here, because this is, and we'll get into Dear Man and Dear Woman here in just a few minutes, but Little People is another one, like a few of these in the book, that are shared amongst multiple tribes that have stories related to the little people. But we're looking at it here in the Bone Picker from the Choctaw perspective a little bit. Can you talk about the little people and their role in Choctaw lore?
Yes, many tribes have little people. And among the Choctaws, they're known as Kawi Anakosha, and that means forest dweller. And their job really is to train medicine men. That is, they take the worthy young boys, they find out if they're worthy or not, and if they are, they train them to become the tribal doctors, medicine men. There's also another group of them, Bopoli, and they may be the mischief makers. So among some tribes, little people are the ones that you can't find your car keys. People say, well, little people took them, or your flower pot is turned over. Well, the little people did it. They just do stuff like that. But with Choctaws, there's not really, I don't know that there's agreement that these are one and the same. They're probably two different groups of little people. I first wrote about the little people again in Roads of My Relations, and that is where I took the story from and put it into the Bone Picker, although I kind of revised it a little bit. And as you saw, the little people and the Champis kind of interact, which is kind of odd. These tiny little beings, and then you got the great big giant, living in the same place. And I do want to give a shout out. There is a book on Audible. It's called Midnight Sun, and it's a story about little people, and they call them Inukkans. I don't know if you listen to Audible, but it's really worth taking a listen to that, because that's a whole different take on little people, and they are up in Alaska. But again, every tribe is going to have a different name for their little people.
It's time for a short break for us. The book today is The Bone Picker. The author is Devin Mahisua, who's joining me for the hour. I'm Logan Layden, KGOU Managing Editor, and this is the KGOU Readers Club. We'll be back after this. Now with the KGOU Readers Club. I'm Managing Editor Logan Layden, and I've got Devin Mahisua with me, author of the new book, The Bone Picker from OU Press. We continue our conversation now. There's so many, like I say, the mix of history and lore, but there's also issues that we get to in some of them. So this must have been, we'll talk about a little later, but fun to write. The yellow-bellied sapsucker.
Mm-hmm.
There's a really interesting story in there about pretendians, and one in particular who's trying to pass themselves off as Native American when they're not, and the sort of comeuppance that happens around that. It strikes me as something that probably you as the author are personally annoyed by and maybe see happening in real life and brought that into the world of fiction. If you could talk about that.
I wrote that short story in a day. It actually first appeared in the magazine Apex, well, it's a year and a half ago, I guess. And I know the characters. I know how pretendians behave, how those who defend them behave, how they whittle their way into academia, literature, acting, the arts, and how much damage they can do. And I know their strategies because I've seen it and I've heard it countless times. And so that story basically wrote itself. And and so our character, our lead character, he is being warned by Biskinik, the little yellow-bellied sapsucker, which is the little bird that brings you the news, tries to warn him, and he's just not going to have it because he's so deep into this deception. But yes, again, in answer to your question, again, I write about things that deeply concern me, and pretendianism and defendianism are among them.
And yeah,
So that found a home.
for those who don't know, this would be someone who basically appropriates the culture to the
Mhm.
point of even faking their lineage and try to convince people that they're a member of a tribe to gain, I guess, credit, like give more credit to the research and within academia that they're doing, thinking that, well, if I'm going to be properly published and rewarded for my work, I need to fabricate my own ancestry and pretend to be Native American, right?
Yes. Yes, and it isn't just individuals who do this. There are groups of people who have created fake tribes. And the Cherokee Nation and the Katuas, they can really speak to this, just how many fake Cherokee tribes have been created. And they're all over the place. And there's just dozens and dozens of them. And many of them are using this fake identity to get federal funding and grants. And a lot of academics are doing this to also to get the same thing, to get scholarships, to get their jobs. They insert themselves into their writings by saying we and our and us, as if they're trying to lend some kind of knowledge that they really don't have. But many people, they don't know any better. They say, well, you say you're native, I'm going to believe you.
Is
And
that
they just thrive.
I can see where that if you go back decades, that would be, I guess, fairly easy to do. Surely that's getting harder to pull off as we get into the future, right? I mean, people aren't just going to take your word. There's so much ability to actually do research yourself and find out that they're lying. Do you get the sense that that's actually in any way becoming harder to do, maybe?
There have been many prominent pretendians that have been called out, and their genealogies or their backgrounds have been traced back generations. Buffy St. Marie, for one, most recently, and there's quite a few academics who have been called out. The problem is that they are defended by people who hired them. And in academia, it's almost impossible to get them out of there because universities, for example, don't want to admit that they've hired such a person.
Hmm.
Maybe they're afraid of being sued, something like that. But where we're really seeing these people being dismissed from their jobs and removed from positions is in Canada. Canada is really, really being aggressive about this. And so there is the Native American Genealogical Association, it's my understanding, is being formed right now. And more people are being called out, and we're seeing more of them in the papers.
In the Bone Picker, we're at some points we're centuries ago, at some points we're decades ago, at some points we're in the modern day, including when we're getting into stories related to the Deer Man. And in Choctaw, lore, it's deer man, but deer woman is that more prominent across Native American tribes? If you could tell us a little bit about the deer man as it relates to Choctaws and his relation to the other deer folk that other tribes
Yeah.
believe in.
Kashihotapalo. So the deer man, that actually kind of translate to women's scream because when he screams, well, it just sounds like a high-pitched scream, and he's kind of doing it to scare you. You really don't hear a whole lot about the deer man, but you do hear about the deer woman because I think there's more tribes might have their version of deer woman. The deer man in my story, I wanted to create another story to bring back Detective Monique Bluehawk because she has been a part of my detective series, paranormal book series. And so here she and Monique and her family encounter the deer man, um, in Oklahoma, and they're not quite sure what to make of it. I mean, how many people come face to face with this entity that looks like a deer for a good portion of his body, but then he's got an old man's face and he's got human eyes. And and so I really wanted to bring him in because again, he's not malevolent, but he can do some damage because he does traumatize some hunters
Mm-hmm.
in this story. But then in the end, we also find out that the deer man doesn't just have a small range. He can range for hundreds of miles if he wants to.
Mm-hmm.
So even at the end of the story, the deer man has the last word. He's still there.
He can range all the way up to our backyards here in Norman,
Yes. Mhm.
from what I see.
Yes.
Um,
Mhm.
when we get toward the end of the book and the story Seeds, I wonder whether there are some apocalyptic themes in that. Obviously, looking back over the centuries and what's happened to the Choctaw people and what humans have done to the planet in general, you get the idea that these creatures perhaps are not very pleased with the way humans and even the Choctaw tribe has evolved over the years. Are there some? I took away some apocalyptic sort of themes from this last story. Replacing the seeds with the eggs of sort of invasive insects and sort of sabotaging the attempt to even fix the
Mhm.
damage that has been done. I just wonder, and people have to read it for themselves, what you were trying to get at with that final story with seeds.
Well, you have in the story, and she makes an appearance, Hoyo Chishpa, she is the corn goddess. And so she is the one who brought the corn, food to the Choctaws, when they first emerged out of the ground. But then you had Iskele, who is the grasshopper goddess, who is underground, who is still angry because when the humans came up out of the ground, they crushed a lot of her children. And so she's still angry about that, as you read in that story. And I think she's also very angry about the way that the environment um, is being treated. And I don't know that she's necessarily angry only at Choctaws. I think it's just the whole world situation. So she comes up with a solution. Well, maybe let's just kind of start over if we can. But I think that story also shows in Seeds, that particular story, I think that the entities don't always agree on what should be done. They just act on their own.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm just going to do this. And so I guess it remains to be seen. Well, what are the other entities going to do once they find out that this one just did something that could be a bad thing?
They don't seem generally out to kill people, and sometimes if they do, they themselves can be punished. But they do want to annoy people, confuse them, frighten them for their own amusement. And it seems like that's
Mhm.
tolerated to a point, but they can also go too far.
Well, there has to be checks and balances,
Yeah.
because otherwise all of these beings are very powerful. And they have to have some sort of rules and regulations. And I think the ones that really are behaving badly, they know they're doing it. They just haven't been caught.
Well, I think as people read the book, as I did, you'll ask yourself along the way, How much of this story is based in actual reality, like historical
Mhm.
documented events, and how much is the author telling her own story here and taking some leeway on their own? And I think it's best just to enjoy the read. Not everybody's going to have the opportunity to sit down and ask you directly, well, was this person a real person? Did this actually happen? But it must have been really fun to write. If you could talk a little bit about the process of bringing the Bone Picker together. How long did it take? What went into it? And was it an enjoyable experience to put this together?
Well, Well, the way this book came about, it was very curious. It was very different from all the other 20 something books that I've written because I tend to write short stories when I'm stuck working on a larger work. And I needed to break from the novel that I mentioned earlier, Blood Relay, that will be out next year. So I took a step back and I wrote 3 or 4 of the stories. And I find that I can write short stories pretty fast. It has to be a compelling story, and you have to be concise with no extraneous descriptions or wandering off to, detail how the main character brushes her teeth. You really got to get to it and stay with it. And that's what I really like about good short stories because you can go back and read it again and still get the message maybe that the author is trying to convey. But anyway, I decided to take the one that was already published, which was Tenure, and I thought, well, maybe I could just make a collection out of this. So I started adding and looking at my nonfiction work to see, well, what is it in that I have written the nonfiction stuff? How can I create a horror story or dark fiction out of this? So that is where, the Ned Christie and Archwolf came from, and then Solomon Hotema, and then my work in indigenous food sovereignty really played a role. There's kind of a thread that runs through some of those stories. And I had already written again, about Shompies and little people and shapeshifters and time travel in Roads of My Relations back in 2000. And that actually might be the first horror book written by a Native person, or one of them. I know there was a book called Nightwing about bats or something. If you remember that, I think it was also a movie that came out. So after I put that book together, I submitted it to Oklahoma Press and they liked it, they took it, and then I finished my novel within a matter of weeks. So that was just the break that I needed. It was just, I guess you call it hopping around from one writing project to the other. You get stuck on one thing, then just go to the other.
Yeah.
And it worked for me.
Well, I enjoyed it very much. Like I said at the beginning, it's more than just scary tales to talk around the campfire with. There's Choctaw beliefs and history. There are issues that you get to. What do you hope that readers take away from The Bone Picker after they've read it?
I would say that to understand that tribes are not monolithic, they're not all the same, and tribes are very complex cultures. And they have their social, political, religious spheres. They are in different environments, differing reactions to the colonizers, different reactions to the missionaries. Some, even within the same tribe, intermarried more than others. Some have retained traditions and language, more than other tribes. And I want these stories to be entertaining, but I also think that because there's so few Native writers out there, that we really do bear some responsibility to educate.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today, Devin Mayasua, the author of The Bone Picker from OU Press, and that's going to be coming out on October 8th. So just in time for October and spooky season here. Although, like I said, there's much more to The Bone Picker than just these scary stories. Thanks for being with me. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you very much, Logan. I appreciate it.
Of course. Once again, the book is The Bone Picker from OU Press. The author is Devin Mayasua. We'll talk to you next time for the KGOU Readers Club.